Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, back with another video. So, when I made my last video, where I was talking about the aftermath of the Josh Taylor versus Jack Catterall fight, one of the things that I forgot to mention in that video, in fact there was a few things, but one of the things I forgot to mention was the fact that when I was able to find a copy of the fight, I would watch the fight, rescore the fight, and tell you guys my thoughts on it. And the reason why I was going to do that is because when I woke up that morning, and this is of course the morning after the fight, I actually received several messages, and everywhere I looked, I started to see these comments, and I saw comments from quite a few people saying that they rewatched the fight. I don't know whether they watched it on Daily Motion. I think there's a few copies of it on there, but I've seen quite a few comments of people saying that they rewatched the fight, and it wasn't as bad as they initially thought on the night. And a lot of people I received a few messages from and a few comments were pointing out that the Sky Sports commentary was incredibly biased in Jack Catterall's favour. That was what a few people were insinuating. This isn't coming from me, of course. This is coming from those people. So that really motivated me to want to rewatch the fight and give it a round-by-round score. Because that's one thing that I've spoken about in the past, is how one of the things that I've noticed about Sky Sports in particular is how they're very, 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 very good at creating robbery narratives. Alright, let's not forget, shall we, the embarrassment that was Arthur Abraham versus Paul Smith. You guys remember that fight where Arthur Abraham literally gave Paul Smith a boxing lesson. The fight wasn't even competitive. Anybody that thought Paul Smith won that fight is a special kind of spastic. I'm not even kidding. Like, if you thought Paul Smith won that fight, don't even watch this video. Bugger off. I don't even want to talk to you. It wasn't even close. But because you had Jim Watt and that absolute clown piece of crap commentator, what's his name, Nick Halling, that idiot, who were claiming that the fight was a robbery. And not only that, but what they were doing was they were trying to implant the robbery narrative in your head before the fight even started. You know, they were talking about, oh, it's so hard to get a decision in Germany, and he's going to have to knock him out to get a draw in Germany. And, you know, the typical subliminal nonsense that Sky Sports does when they're covering a fight over there. You know, they've always got to put the robbery narrative in your head. They've got to plant the seed, and then when the fight's happening, if a round is in any way competitive, they'll give it to the British fighter. And that's of course what they did in that fight, and it created a narrative that Smith won the fight. However, the next day when people actually sat down and watched it, they were like, hey, come on, like, this is ridiculous. This was even the Matchroom Sky Sports fanboys that called it a robbery initially, upon rewatching it, were like, hang on a second, this wasn't a robbery. You know, so there's a lot of situations like that in my lifetime with boxing. I remember when Manny Pacquiao completely and utterly schooled Marquez in the third fight. I don't give a crap what anybody says. That was a clear win for Manny Pacquiao, and it wasn't even that close. But because the commentary was fanboying for Marquez and dick riding him and spunking up his back the whole fight and orgasming every time Marquez landed a punch, people thought the fight was a robbery. So that's my point. Commentary can influence how people see fights. So let me stop rambling. Let me get on to this Josh Taylor fight, because everybody and their mother last night was saying the fight was a robbery. I thought Catterall won the fight when I watched it live, and I decided to reserve judgment. You guys that were on live streams with me will notice that I wasn't willing to call it a robbery, despite the fact I thought Catterall won, because I wanted to reserve judgment. So I decided to rewatch the fight today, watched it. I had the Sky Sports commentary, but I was trying not to pay attention to them. And this is how I saw the fight. The first round I gave to Jack Catterall. The reason I gave it to Jack Catterall was because he landed a left hand in the early part of the round. I think it must have been like 20 seconds into the round, maybe not even that. He landed a left hand on Taylor's chin, which buzzed Taylor and backed him up. That was the only meaningful punch of the round. Neither guy did anything after that. It was a very cagey and very tentative round. But I gave it to Catterall because he landed the one meaningful shot of the round. The second round, oh, and I forgot to mention, there was several clinches from Catterall already in the first round, which the commentators didn't even mention, I don't think. The second round was a clear round for Josh Taylor. He dominated the second round. Catterall did nothing except hold, and Taylor backed him up the whole round and completely outworked him. Somehow, by this point in the fight already, the CompuBox numbers had Jack Catterall landing on like dozens of shots already. I've no idea how. Worked that one out. The third round was a close round, but I thought Taylor just was busier. He outworked Catterall, backed him up the whole round, and Catterall again was holding and spoiling. He landed a couple of good shots though, but wasn't enough to win the round. Taylor backed him up the whole round, completely outworked him. The fourth round I gave to Catterall. It was in fact a dominant round for Catterall. He hurt Josh Taylor a couple of times, landed some beautiful combinations. Sadly though, Catterall also landed a blatant, intentional low blow in view of the referee. Of course, Matthew Macklin on the commentary team said it was a good body shot, a good body shot. Yeah, that was Matthew Macklin's assessment of it. There was also non-stop holding from Catterall in the fourth round, so by that point, there should have already been a point deduction because he'd spent the majority of the fight clinching, and that was a blatant, intentional low blow. So I gave the round to Catterall though because he was the only one landing meaningful shots. The fifth round, dominant round for Catterall. Once again, there was still a lot of holding and headlocking from Catterall, but outside of that, he completely schooled Josh Taylor in the fifth round. I don't think there's any argument where you could give that round to Josh. The sixth round, once again, gave it to Catterall. He was holding non-stop, like the holding was getting out of control, and he was headlocking Taylor constantly. And it was just the type of round where I think the holding was so prolific to the point where Taylor was getting really sloppy, and he just couldn't get his offense going at all. Seventh round was a clear round for Josh Taylor. Catterall did nothing in the seventh round except hold. And once again, Taylor was just outworking him, backing him up. Landed some pretty good shots on the inside. There was a couple of rabbit punches, if I recall, from Taylor, but I believe that those were initiated by the clinches from Catterall. I was actually surprised watching the fight a second time how much Catterall got away with in this fight. It was absolutely despicable, the amount of holding that Catterall got away with. And I'm disgusted by the fact that most people in the YTBC, even people I respect, are not even mentioning it. The holding in this fight, he was worse than Lawrence Okolie in there. I don't think I've seen anything like it in a long time. That was Vladimir Klitschko versus Povetkin level of holding, like non-stop holding from Jack Catterall, and the commentators barely even mentioned it. Like the Sky Sports commentators, they didn't seem to give a shit. So yeah, that was a clear round for Taylor. The eighth round, Catterall scored a knockdown, and after scoring the knockdown, he hits Josh Taylor on the floor to the back of the head, which should have been an immediate disqualification. If Catterall had been a travelling fighter from a foreign country, he probably would have been disqualified for that. I mean, why he wasn't disqualified, I've no idea. He did it in blatant view of the referee, and not only did he not get disqualified, he didn't even have a point deducted, so disgraceful from Jack Catterall. But Josh Taylor got up, and the round was actually pretty close outside of the knockdown, but you have to give it 10-8 to Jack Catterall. The ninth round was a clear win for Josh Taylor. Catterall did nothing but hold the entire round once again, and the holding was getting more and more prolific. And I felt as if Catterall, because he scored a knockdown, and because his corner were telling him he was winning, he believed that he was in too big a lead for Taylor to really catch up with him. So he just decided to go into survival mode, and he spent the entire round doing nothing but holding, and Taylor completely outworked and outlanded him. Once again, the CompuBox numbers for the fight were complete bullshit. Don't believe him for a second. And yeah, Taylor just outworked him that round. 10th round was a clear round for Josh Taylor. Catterall did next to nothing, holding, running, headlocking, and Taylor completely outworked him. And to make it a bigger round for Taylor, Taylor was getting tied up once again. I think Catterall like pulled his head down while he was trying to clinch, and Catterall actually had a point deducted by the referee, and rightfully so. But it was too late in the fight. He should have had points deducted earlier, particularly when he hit Taylor while he was down. And he'd been clinching the whole fight. I don't know why the referee waited until round 10 to finally take a point, but I digress. Big round for Taylor. Going into the 11th round, Taylor was a bit cagey, a bit hesitant in the 11th round. I felt he needed to pick up the pace, but what he was doing was he was backing Catterall up. Catterall was trying to throw some little slappy backhanders towards the end of the round to try and nick it, but I don't think he did enough. I think the round was very close, but I just felt that Taylor, because he was the aggressor and because he was backing Catterall up, and I felt the shots he did land that round were slightly heavier, slightly more telling, I gave the round to Josh Taylor. However, at the end of the round, one of the most despicable things I've ever seen in a British boxing ring, Taylor tapped Jack Catterall lightly on the stomach on the way back to the corner, as fighters often do. Sometimes they touch gloves, sometimes they just tap him on the stomach. He had a point deducted. The referee took a point off Josh Taylor for absolutely no reason whatsoever. So even though Taylor won the round, it was an even round because of the point deduction. And the 12th round was an absolutely dominant round for Josh Taylor. If you gave that round to Jack Catterall, you're a complete and utter spaz, because he did nothing. Taylor backed him up the whole round, outworked him, and finished the fight like a champion. So this was a very, very close fight to me. Taylor won the last 4 rounds, had a point deduction in his favour and against him, so really that's a pointless thing, isn't it? You know, the point deduction. Both guys had a point deducted, so I'm going to ignore those point deductions. So I gave the first round to Catterall, the second and third rounds to Taylor, the 4th, 5th and 6th rounds to Catterall, the 7th round to Taylor, the 8th round to Catterall with a knockdown, which shouldn't have been counted because he hit him while he was down, and it should have been a DQ. The 9th round to Taylor, 10th round to Taylor, 11th round to Taylor, 12th round dominant for Taylor. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rounds to Taylor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rounds to Catterall with a knockdown. This was a fair decision. The judges got it absolutely right as far as I'm concerned. And once again, Sky Sports have hypnotized and manipulated the boxing public into creating another false robbery. This is Sven Ottke versus Robin Reed 2.0. That's what this is. You remember, when Sven Ottke clearly outboxed and outworked and outlanded and handily beat Robin Reed, whereas Robin Reed tried to foul the entire fight, spent the whole fight hitting on the break, holding, hitting behind the head, hitting round the back, and just generally being a dirty piece of shit the whole fight. And Sven Ottke fought within the rules, dominated the championship rounds, and swept the second half of the fight. And at least in that fight, though, the referee did his job. And, of course, the British commentators, just like they did here, decided to create a false robbery narrative. Typical from Sky Sports, typical from casual boxing fans who haven't got a fucking clue what they're looking at, and typical from people in the YTBC who have agendas and are just trying to push nonsense. Let's be honest, this wasn't a robbery. Very, very close fight. Could have gone either way. I would have been happy with a draw. In fact, I believe I even had it a draw. My maths isn't very good, but I gave Taylor 7 rounds, gave Catterall 6 rounds, and he had a knockdown. The 2 point deductions, I'm not even counting them because both guys had a point deducted, so who cares? This was a fairly officiated in terms of how it was scored, but the referee, Marcus McDonnell, is a disgrace, and I actually feel watching the fight a second time round, had Catterall not have been allowed to hold as much as he was, he might have gotten beaten convincingly, maybe even stopped, because in the second half of the fight, well, when I say the second half, pretty much after the 8th, where he scored the knockdown, which actually worked against him because he kind of switched off after that. He was in complete survival mode and he was hanging on for dear life. Taylor was hitting him to the body. Taylor was backing him up the whole fight. Taylor was the aggressor throughout, and most people don't know shit about boxing. This was another fake robbery. This was another Felix Sturm Matthew Macklin, where Felix Sturm beat the dog shit out of Matthew Macklin, and all the little gimps on Sky Sports and all the British fanboys called it a robbery. This is the same bullshit as that. Typical fake robbery. And yeah, Sky Sports used the whole England versus Scotland thing to get people riled up, and it seems to me like this was some sort of ploy to get a nationalistic war going. In reality, that was a fairly scored fight, and Jack Catterall, based on his disgraceful performance, which was filled with nothing but fouls and spoiling, he didn't deserve the title. So I'm glad. If he'd have won the fight fairly, and if he'd have won the fight legitimately, I'd have been happy for Jack Catterall. But thankfully, the judges did the right thing, and Taylor held on to his belts, and he goes on to bigger and better things. Jack Catterall has been bitching and moaning on social media like a sore loser. Well, like Robin Reed, you shouldn't have tried to cheat your way to victory. That's all I'm going to say. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. Proceed to hit the dislike button and bitch and moan in the comments if you like. And for those of you who understand boxing, you'll watch the fight again and you'll see what I see. Probably. So there you go. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching. God bless.